very warm welcome to today's Life Science Careers Week Spotlight On session. We're delighted to be joined by our guest speaker today, Amanda Stranks, who is a patient and public involvement and communication strategy lead for the NIHR Cambridge Biomedical Research Centre. So we will meet Amanda fully in a moment, but we really just wanted to start off by welcoming you all to the call. And I'm conscious that some people will still be filtering in, so we'll just go a little bit slowly at the beginning. So Amanda, without further ado, if I could invite you to introduce yourself and tell us about your career journey to date and what it is briefly that you're up to in your current role at the moment.
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for having me along today. In terms of my career story, and actually I've really enjoyed seeing everything that you're popping in the chat. For a long time for me, it's been about trying to find a role that lets me get paid to do the things that I really enjoyed. And in terms of my kind of family background, I don't come from an academic background or a science background or a communications background. My dad was a farmer and my mum was a teacher. But I really liked science at school. And I thought initially after leaving high school that I wanted to be a science teacher, specifically physics and chemistry. I was very interested in physics and chemistry. And I went on to do, in Australia, we do just like a general science degree that you can do, a Bachelor of Science degree. And I started off in physics and chemistry. And I quickly realized that although I had very much liked high school physics, I did not like university physics at all. And in order to make up the units that I needed for my degree, I was forced to pick up biology. And to my utter horror, I started to enjoy it. And I have been getting further into that and sort of transitioning across to medical science and eventually public health as I went along. And at the end of my undergraduate degree, I moved with my partner, my now husband, over to the UK. And was offered the opportunity to do a PhD at Oxford, and I did that in clinical medicine. And I thought that was really interesting. I enjoyed my PhD. And as part of the PhD, I also really enjoyed getting involved in public engagement type events. I've always really liked to talk about research and to understand other people's research and to try and, for want of a better description, bring people together over research. So where people feel like they can't quite understand how bits of a puzzle fit together, I kind of enjoyed that aspect. And as you do at the end of a PhD, kind of learning again about how academic careers work and sort of watching all my peers go on, I went on to do my first postdoctoral fellowship, and I did that at the Jenner Institute in Oxford. So a topic that, although related in terms of immunology, like my PhD was quite different. So my first postdoc was around transcriptomic responses to influenza vaccines and malaria vaccines. I thought that was really interesting, quite enjoyed that. And then we moved over to the US for a couple of years because my partner had a fellowship at MIT. And so I did another postdoctoral fellowship at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And again, immunology kind of being as close to a common theme as I could pull together for what I liked about research. I did a postdoc there looking at responses to a new way to treat peanut allergy in children. And again, thought that was really interesting, met loads of people, learned more about how clinical trials worked. And I thought, well, I very much like the human elements of things. But mostly I love to talk to other people about research. So I'd always been part of kind of postdoctoral fellowship organizations and research engagement and public engagement types of things. And again, more than anything else, I love to hear what other people were doing to be able to kind of explain that to other people and to drag science out of the lab and into the community, as it were. But even at that stage, I wasn't really thinking about research communication specifically. And I think if you'd asked me what it was that I was enjoying doing, I would have said what I just said now. I wouldn't have said science communication. I would have said, I just really I really enjoy talking about research. And I didn't have a strong plan about what I wanted to do next, although I briefly decided that perhaps I'd like to study medicine. I am a bit of a perpetual student. That will show up also in my career. I think, I want to do something similar, not quite where I want to be just yet, but I think I'm close. I know the things that I liked. And that was when Jeremy Hunt was a health minister. And I decided fairly quickly that, no, actually, I don't think I want to study medicine, but I would like to get more and more into the clinical trials. So I thought perhaps what I liked was that interaction with actual patients. I wanted to take my science, having come from physics and chemistry, all the way through biology and human immunology and preclinical research. I thought perhaps clinical trials, maybe that's where I want to be. And so I applied for and was successful to get a place on the MPhil course at the School of Public Health here in Cambridge. And I did my MPhil year. And I thought it was fascinating, really loved it, met lots of people, talked a lot about research, loved doing my essays. So my essays that I did for my MPhil were all about communication of risk and understanding why people don't get their vaccines and things like that. And I really, even more than all the other topics, I thought those were fascinating. I couldn't stop talking about those particular things because I was really fascinated by what that research told me about what the public understand about research and why and how it influences the choices they make about their own healthcare. And because there's never a good time to do anything, at the same time as I started my MPhil, I discovered I was pregnant with my daughter. It was an interesting year, doing lots of things at once. I don't recommend writing theses while you're pregnant, but you know, we managed to do all of that. And I submitted my thesis and then kind of had my maternity break, which was quite useful in the sense that it let me have a bit of a check. What was it that I really wanted to do? And I was browsing, did I want to do another postdoc? Did I want to do another PhD? Did I want to do study of my own? So it's kind of the point in my research career where had I wanted to follow a traditional trajectory, I really needed to apply for my own research funding. And as you can kind of guess from this slightly scattergun approach, I find lots of research interesting. Like I can browse, I go on the University of Cambridge careers website all the time and I can look at the list and be like, oh, that sounds really interesting and that sounds really interesting and perhaps I'd like to do that. But there was no research topic that I loved enough to imagine chasing research funding for it, even for my own, even for 3 years. And, compared to a lot of my peers who have gone on to become very successful academics, my husband has been studying solar cells since his PhD. That's his kind of career trajectory. He's an academic now. He loves to do that. Whereas I'm a shopper. I want to hear about other people's research. I want to read more. I want to study more. I want to talk to people. And because, food costs money and I had to do things to pay rent and stuff like that, I was starting to browse the job listings and I came across one that was called Translational Research Facilitator. And I thought, okay, that sounds kind of close again. I feel I like to help people with research. I like to bring people together. I like them to help them understand. And I went to the job interview and realized about 3 seconds into the job interview that it was not what I wanted to do. But it was still very interesting. And there were some lovely people on the panel and I had a chat and I thought, well, in the end, it's my first job interview after taking maternity leave. Great to get my foot back in the game. And was very surprised to be offered the role. It's the only job I've ever turned down. But was really lucky in that as part of that interview, one of the things and where I realized I didn't want it is that originally the job advert had talked all about public engagement and about how this particular project was going to be about running public engagement and public communication for that particular department, helping out with PhD program and things like that. So I'd spent a lot of time in the interview talking about how much I love to talk about research. And I was really lucky that afterwards one of the interview panels had reached out to me and said, actually, do you know, I've got a job that I think you might be really interested in. And here I am 6 years later, and I'm forever grateful. I mean, I remember sitting in many kind of events like you're sitting in now, where people after people told me how lucky they were to get their jobs and being like, well, that's not helpful because that doesn't help me. I can't, help myself to be lucky. But it really took me this long to understand that there was a name for the types of things that I wanted to do. And I think part of my problem, and I'm so pleased that you're all here, is that I identified, as it were, as a scientist for so long that I didn't think of myself as a communicator. Like you could not have forced me into a communications degree in undergraduate or even all the way through postgraduate. And in fact, I didn't do a formal communications study course until I had this current role, because that's just not how I saw myself. And yet all throughout, all I could talk about was how much I love to talk about research and science and healthcare and to help people understand. And so it's kind of one of those personal reflection things for me that looking back, kind of makes sense, not really a surprise. And I'm just really grateful that I have a job now that lets me talk about as much research as I would like, from people ranging from sort of government officials, professors at the top of their kind of field, right down to patients and members of the public, all grades of research in between. And I really like that challenge. And being in Cambridge, I just get exposed to the most wonderful research stories, things that work, things that don't work, things that go a long way. And it just feel forever grateful to be able to do both of those things and be paid for it.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I really enjoyed listening to your story there. I mean, it sounds to me like there was lots of things that you were playing with as ideas, like, oh, maybe it's clinical trials, maybe it's pursuing the research funding. And actually, it sounds like thinking about and trying those things out resulted in a process of elimination, yes, which allowed then this sort of message you were sending to yourself about the fact you love to talk about research really sort of come to the fore. So I think that's a nice message that, you know, eliminating things is just as good as sort of including things on the list. And I really, you know, your point about look, it's really interesting, isn't it, this idea of look, because actually if you hadn't have been curious about some of these things, you wouldn't have been in the place to have the look in the first place. But then I'm being terribly careers consultancy about this whole thing. So let me come back to what the audience want to find out, which is probably a little bit more about what your job as a public and patient engagement lead and psychoms lead involves at the moment. Tell us a bit more about that, please.
Sure. So you're absolutely right. My job title is rather insane, and I do love whenever I have a form that gives me this much to write down my job title when it covers all of those things. I often think about my job in two halves. So there is the patient engagement side that I spend a lot of time doing, and then the communications element. And I'll often say to people, I'm, again, very lucky in the sense that in my job, I get to see, first of all the research ideas. So generally researchers will come to me at the very beginning of their projects when they have to involve patients and members of the public, and I get to see all of their ideas and their research applications, and then they go off and do the research. And then if it works, I get to see them again at the end of their journey to help them communicate their research. So getting to do both of those things. Also, as you introduced, I work specifically for and paid through the National Institute for Health Research, Cambridge Biomedical Research Centre, which means that to some degree, the very narrow slice of communications that I'm responsible for is around what we call translational research. So that's the field of health research that sits between preclinical research, so all those early animal studies, for example, anything that's in cells or trying to understand how a disease works or what causes it. And on the other side being those clinical trials where they're testing a drug that's been already developed. The idea behind translational research is to bridge those two. So we have a lot of clinician scientists that work at the Biomedical Research Centre. Some of them are academics who also have roles in the hospital. And it's kind of their job, as it were, to recognise the potential of clinical research, of preclinical, research, to think, well, that might make a good drug, or let's try and test that, or maybe let's reuse that drug elsewhere, and be able to have those early studies that let you know whether or not it's safe and it works. And then that means, though, that there's quite a sifting that I do. So I hear about lots of research stories, and then either it is my job directly to organise, as it were, the communications for it. So I might be having to write up a press release, or often pieces that go with that. So I might be trying to find a patient story, for example. I need to let our funders know. And again, the NIHR, filling that kind of narrow window, really wants to have more and more stories that show what the translational research element does. So in addition to the actual press release and doing all the bits that go with that, so pitching it to news organisations, there is often a bit of background work that goes on to produce things like blogs or newsletters or policy documents, so that ministers in the government can turn around to the government and say, this is what we're doing with your money. And so that also requires then understanding the difference between those different parts of research. And of course, researchers themselves don't always know. So a bit of what I do as well is kind of triage to other communicators on campus. So organisations like the medical school itself, and the university has a comms lead. Sometimes the right person to write a particular press release is Craig Briley, so I would get in touch with Craig. Or it might be that the funder in a particular story is Cancer Research UK, and so then it would be getting in touch with my colleagues there, or MRC, or any of the other numerous acronyms that are across Cambridge and might have a research story. So it does, I like that I also get to use my knowledge of kind of the local research landscape, the politics behind all of research, to help navigate that, because we have a lot of things that we have to get right to please funders, to please government, to make sure that even our individual organisations are meeting their communications goals, and of course telling the story itself and getting to pull that out. And that's nice, keeps me busy.
That's great, thank you. So, and what might you describe as a kind of typical day, if there was one? And if there isn't a typical day, maybe tell us about what might be happening for the rest of this day.
I'm going to go with across a typical week.
Great.
Across in my, I mean, everything, like so many jobs these days, starts with an inbox. A typical inbox for me might look like a heads up from a research team themselves that they've got a paper that has either just been submitted or has been funded. And it doesn't always contain more information than that. So researchers themselves often don't know much about the communications process. And even for me, that in and of itself is delightful, because if they've told me, then I can do something about it. And then depending on what stage of the story is at, with that, we would set off through my team kind of the communications pipeline, as it were. So we'd be looking to, does it need a press release? Who's going to write that? Have all the relevant people been involved? Is there an embargo? That kind of thing. So of my 5-day week, there's probably roughly one day that goes to that kind of thing, although it gets spread across the week as we check emails and check with the right people and that kind of thing. On the patient engagement side, we'll probably also have quite a few consultations across the week with researchers who are applying for funding and either doing communications planning for that or helping them put together their public engagement strategies. Almost every week, my team and I would have some kind of public engagement activity, a communications activity that we would ourselves be running. And that usually takes a day or so. That might be either on behalf of our researchers, so running something like an open day, or on the 20th, it's a leap year this year, so on the 29th of February, we have our Rare Disease Day lecture. And so organising the researchers for that, deciding the key message, all of the horrible logistics that go behind something like that, although I have a team for that. And then sort of other type things might be, again, kind of internal comms, so bringing together researchers across and within my organisation to either talk about how we can communicate better, or little things like pulling together newsletters and chasing stories and chasing things up. And I'm not going to lie, the other day is mostly admin and replying to all the emails that I didn't get to earlier in the week when I was writing the press release or running the public engagement event or working with members of the public.
Great, thank you. That's such a brilliant oversight to sort of hear that, and the number of different clients and stakeholders that you're working with in order to get the communications out there. It just sounds, yeah, incredible. And I was just wondering if I could kind of follow up and ask, in all of your work, what do you think you find the most challenging?
There are several things. So I think sometimes it's the stories themselves in a really nice way. Like, I'm privileged to get to tell some really technical stories around big things in the field at the moment. And some of the people in the chat might have come across many of these, are things like health data, artificial intelligence, gene therapy, and new medical technologies. And so there is always an element of just getting my head around whatever the new tech of the day is, which is nice because it keeps the kind of the science brain of me that started in all of this alive. There's also just understanding the research landscape. Like, again, I didn't myself come from a research background, and so I've kind of got to learn it all from scratch. But that is the landscape itself is kind of twofold, right? There's how research works in general, and there's how Cambridge works and how we all work together. So I think one of the challenges in any given story is understanding who it belongs to, who needs to be told, and there's kind of the gentle political element of that, of not getting it wrong. And so, again, kind of in a nice way, it is partly my job to know a bit of the gossip, for want of a better description, understanding how people got to be where they are. Where a lot of funding bodies, for example, kind of come and go through different funding cycles. So it's understanding where are we today and how is that different than 5 years ago? And that organisation that's currently called this 3 years ago used to be called something, but after a funding change got converted into that. So I think there's kind of that challenge. And then, much like everyone else, just the sheer volume of things that are going on. It's such a privilege to be able to deal with it all. But I would say the two halves of my job in terms of public engagement and research communications operate at completely different speeds. So for public engagement, a lot of that's really long-term planning. What are our goals over the course of a year? Who are the audiences that we're trying to meet? I can schedule my trainings 12 months in advance, my conference presentations and things like that. But a press release that's going to come out on Monday is going to come out on Monday, whether or not I've spent all day in a public engagement event or something like that. And for some reason, there is a universal rule that I'm sure is related to Murphy's Law that all press releases need to come out at 4 p.m. on a Friday, usually in August or January or next to Christmas or just before, an election or something like that. So trying to balance those two things between really fast and not slow, but like very long-term strategic planning with something that needs to be done now, that can be challenging.
It sounds so. That sounds incredible, that sort of breadth of work. So thank you so much for sharing that. And then I guess to ask the inverse, what do you think is the most rewarding part of your role?
I think that moment again when you see there are loads and loads of people who have kind of self-excluded from science and research because they think they're not smart enough to understand it. And when you have that moment of connection, when you find the story, when you find the analogy, when you find the thing that makes it relevant for whoever your audience is, and you see someone go, oh, I get it. I see why that's important to me. I see why it's relevant. I have always liked that, whether it was when I was doing tutoring. I think that's why I wanted to be a teacher. Seeing someone connect with something that they thought wasn't accessible to them or that they would normally think, health data, again, huge part of my research. That sounds intrinsically boring. Sometimes it is. But when you can get people to connect with the people that are behind that and where the data comes from and why it's so important, to me, that's the real marker of success. And again, I think getting to be that middle person, I work with so many researchers who want to be able to communicate with members of the public, and they have great skills in research and they have so much talent, but they can't quite express themselves. And I love being the person to be able to connect them to the audiences, or again, help them find the story, help them find the analogy that works to bring those two audiences together.
That's great. And it's really helpful, I think, as well, in terms of understanding that there's the public engagement side of your work. There's the science communications where you're it sounds like you're maybe driving the stories and think about what the government want to know about the outcomes and the outputs. And I wonder if it's just prompted me to think, I wonder if you could just articulate a little bit about what the difference between public and patient engagement might be. Do they differ in many ways?
Yes and no. A lot of what we talk about in patient and public involvement, what might be easier would be to start with the difference between what we would say engagement and involvement is. So involvement is quite specific to healthcare in the sense that we would talk about involvement being about making patients and members of the public part of the research team. So it's taking the expertise that people have about living with a particular healthcare condition and making sure that that expertise is included in all of our research planning, be it how we design a clinical trial or a clinical study, through to how we run it and how we disseminate it. Engagement is a similar and related activity, but its primary purpose is often just the information exchange. So there is often a lot of learning that comes out of engagement, and we can do it on many, many levels. But in many other fields, we don't necessarily do or even need to do that involvement kind of stage. So there is the difference between where the patients come in is that lived experience of their own healthcare. So they tend to be the people who are directly affected by it, as opposed to a member of the public who, we are all potential healthcare users and science users and research users, but it's not necessarily yet relevant to us. And there's also this lovely grey zone when we work on a story about something like cancer screening, for example, where we are all potential end users of screening, but we don't yet have the condition that's being screened for. And I quite like working in those lovely slushy grey zones of bits to help pull apart the information and make things clear. So for me, that's a bonus.
That's super helpful. Thank you so much for taking the time to explain that. And it was really helpful to take it from the angle of involvement and engagement. So thank you. I've got more questions that I could ask you, but I'd really like a chance to come to our audience and see what questions they might have for you. So please do feel free to pop your questions that are sort of popping up in your mind in the Q&A so that we can put the questions to Amanda. So the first one that we've got down here for you, Amanda, is about the necessity of getting sort of further qualifications. So someone is saying, I've got a science PhD, to get into psychoms, do I need to get a master's, for example? What are your thoughts on that, please?
So from my own experience, you don't necessarily need to, because I was very lucky to land this job. I have found it really helpful though. So I mean, a lot of the kind of principles that underpin science communication are things that, particularly if you enjoy already communication and public engagement and things, are probably tools and principles and ideas that you're already using. But like a lot of courses, it is actually really helpful to have those pulled together in a single spot. It's also quite helpful for transitioning from your current field. So you probably already know lots of academics and scientists and public engagement people, again, if you're particularly interested in this field. But I found it really helpful to be exposed. That's where I first had kind of introductions to people working in the media, for example, or people working in policy. And also that doing my course was very much helpful for understanding the sheer number of different roles where this could also be useful. So yes, there's already, if you do a job search, for example, looking for science communications, you can probably already find jobs that have that in its title. But in the various people that presented, and probably similar to the story you're hearing from me today, there are loads of people who go on to do science communication roles that aren't called that. And I mean, it might be that you are just much, much better at researching than I am and already know about those kinds of positions. But one of the things that my course gave me was it kind of helped me to see the types of things that I could be looking for and who I might ask and where I might end up next. I think the other thing as well is that there will always be job applications that ask for either in the required or the desired characteristics. And if you've got the time and the money and the funding, you don't want that to be the hurdle that trips you up. If you, I mean, it's one thing to know people and to have them kind of take you on how they already know about your skills and things like that. But when you are sitting in a pile of applications that's 60, 100, 200 strong, and and the interviewers often have to score, then sometimes having that little line on your CV can be the difference between getting an interview and not. So I did find it very useful, but it's probably not strictly necessary, if that makes sense.
Okay, that's great. So not necessarily a prerequisite,
or rather, not having one shouldn't necessarily stop you in the way that you couldn't be a lawyer without a law degree. It is possible to get science communications positions without having a formal qualification, but those qualifications exist for a reason, and in my experience are quite useful.
Okay, thank you. That's a really useful insight. And we will share, we do have a page on working in science communications and the different types of opportunities and in the slightly different areas that there can be in psychom. So we will share that with you towards the end. Now, there's a great question here, which is a follow-up from the qualifications one, and this is about the kind of qualities that you think you need to have to do this job.
Of the really great science communicators that I've met, I'd say there are a couple of things that kind of shine through. The first is that the really great people, first and foremost, love the science that they're trying to communicate, whatever it is. You meet, even before people do their science communication training, you always meet researchers who, even if they're not great at explaining it, their love for their topic shines through. And so you want to sit and listen to them, and you want to understand what it is that they're trying to tell you about physics or MRI or whatever, because they so clearly believe in it. I think also the real desire to understand audiences and the kind of the people that you're trying to communicate with is often really helpful. And then it goes without saying that being fairly articulate and being able to write or explore other communications mediums is very helpful. But again, of the really great communicators that I know, the thing that shines through is just the fact that they love more than anything else to talk about research, and they care about the people on the other side of whatever it is that they're receiving. And I mean, I think that can also be true if the people on the other side, as it were, if your key audience, even where they are policymakers or government or governance type people, really wanting to have that audience understand what it is that you're trying to say is probably the best thing that you can possess. I've met plenty of communicators who are great writers, but clearly don't care about what they're talking about. And that also comes through often.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. And again, another question which is related, but I think it's a really important one for us to think about. How could students, postdocs use their time at university to develop the skills that they might need for a role like this? Do you have any ideas on that?
Yes, so I think one of the great challenges in this day and age is finding all the wonderful information that's out there, because there are great opportunities through the university, through regional opportunities, through national opportunities. And it's, first of all, unearthing those and then deciding which ones are most relevant to you. So I won't be the first person to tell you all about things like exposure and networking and getting to meet lots and lots of people. But honestly, at least for me, the challenge has always been the number of times you see something that happened a week ago and you think, gosh, that actually would have been really useful. But through the postdoc society, through various things like I'm a scientist, get me out of here. There are different kind of like internships and things like that you can do through many of the major organizations, including things like major health charities. The government and the civil service have a few. So having a look for those kinds of opportunities, if that's what you're interested in, because a lot of those happen over the summer term, for example, and you can do different projects that are specifically based around science. And then I think also, at least what I found useful, is having a play at different ones of those events and activities that are aimed at different audiences, and seeing, is it that you prefer to do kind of mass media, general comms journalism, or is it that you prefer to do, slightly more patient-oriented things like, would you rather be one of the people who works for example, Cancer Research UK, speaking directly to patients, or are you more interested in evidence? And if you can start looking at those kinds of roles, trying to align your opportunities with it, gives you a way to narrow down your search. And if you don't know, try them all, or as many as you can fit into your schedule. Colleges and things are also a great place to start. And I think, particularly if you are based in Cambridge, my other piece of advice for you would be to look at other regional opportunities. So Cambridge itself has a fantastic environment, loads and loads of academic research that we can get involved in. But across the region, there are also other science fairs, for example, other hospital trusts, similarly across the rest of the UK, that will give you a different flavour and different audiences to work with. I don't need to tell you that people are different necessarily across the UK and in different places, but it will help you see a wider slice of landscape and help you practice working with different audiences. So I'd really encourage you to look at going to different types of science fair, for example, and kind of different opportunities at smaller locations, just again, because it will give you a different insight into the public, as it were, and the people that you'll be communicating with.
That's a really interesting point, given what you were saying about one of the key qualities needed is to understand audiences. So the more you can diversify the audiences you're exposed to now, then I guess the more likely you are to develop that quality. That's really helpful. Thank you. And also, I've just had a little look at the chat, and I can see that brilliantly we've got somebody representing a science communication publication that we have here at Cambridge. I don't know if I'm about to pronounce this correctly, Rachel. Blue Sky. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. But in any case, Lucy's added a link there to that, and it seems like they're recruiting someone at the moment to do an officer work. So that's really lovely and serendipitous. So there's an answer to the person who asked that question about opportunities that there might be. So somebody, Chloe, thank you for the question, has asked a brilliant question. It's very specific, and it is about working on a press release. What does it involve? Could you walk us through that, please?
Yes, I can. So press releases themselves tend to be not quite formulaic, but they do follow a specific pattern. And again, there's actually quite a lot of guidance out there if you just wanted to practice writing your own. And it is one of the things that I had not been exposed to at all before doing my psychoms degree. It does depend, again, how you approach things. So I quite like to, often if you're writing a press release, you'll have a paper or a journal, a story to start with. And it tends to, it's kind of it's like a pyramid. So you have to first of all find what the key message is, and then the second kind of sub headline is they'll often say the key message is what you want people who don't even read the story to take away with them, and the second kind of sub headline that they'll say is what you kind of want people to tell their mum or their partner, or the thing that they want people want as the follow-up question. And then the next chunk of information is the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And then depending on your specific field, there's kind of other bits that go in with that. For a lot of the press releases that I will work on after you've kind of told that main story and the bit of, additional information for people who are still reading at that point, that's often when we'll start to bring in things like a patient or a human element to it. So we'll try and go find someone who's got lived experience or direct experience. And again, because most of the things that I talk about are things like clinical trials. And also for my personal purposes, because often it's related to funders, there will also usually be a quote or an element or part of it that talks about where the funding and kind of underpinning elements of it are. But there is some really great advice and guidance, and not quite templates, but frameworks that you can find. And it is a really good thing to practice. Actually, if you've got your own papers or papers from your department, even if you don't write the full press release in full every time, going through and dot pointing out, what do I think is the take-home message from this story? What are the key points of information that people need to know? Is there some kind of human interest element that I could bring into it? Who would I go looking for a quote from if this were my story? Are there other elements that I'd need to be aware of in terms of funding or politics or departments? And just practice dot pointing those out for you, help you see stories and your own kind of papers really differently.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing the kind of framework that works for you. And Lucy has just shared some university comms office references
Perfect.
as well. So there's more information from that. But I love that idea about giving it, if you're interested in this as a potential career, picking up a paper and just trying out writing a press release or summarizing what someone has said. So thank you so much for that thought. That's brilliant. So again, another brilliant specific question from Phoebe. Could you talk a bit more about what it's like communicating science to policymakers, please?
I can, yes. Particularly when I finished my MPhil, this was another area that I was really interested in, because I'm quite interested in impact. I'm interested in research making a difference. And both from that training and from kind of the conversations that I've had with various politicians and people in that field since, I think the thing that really stands out for me is that politics and policy has its own timeline that doesn't necessarily well overlap with the stories of the day. So one of the challenges with policy is to be able to spot the gap, the political opportunity, the space for getting your very important information in to be able to make something, to make a change, to be able to guide it. I think the other thing is that, much like, or at least the other thing that I have found, not coming from that as a background, so I don't have, other than the little bit in the MPhil, any formal training in politics, and I didn't know anyone who worked in politics up until that point, is that at first, a lot of the work that you need to do is around building your own networks to even understand where the doors are that you're trying to bang on, unless you're going through a very kind of formal route. So there are definitely, at least in the area that I work in terms of health policy, there are some formal policy making organisations like NICE, for example, so the National Institute of Care Excellence, who drive a lot of that kind of thing and have direct lines to ministers. But some of your first layer of work, as it were, will be identifying people that can kind of get you within the sphere of, because a lot of the policy making is kind of, at least as I understand it, it's quite accidental. There is some really great training available through university, or there's an organisation, the Science, CUSP, I think is the acronym. It's like Cambridge University Science Policy. Lucy's nodding frantically. I've had some lovely chats with people there over the time, and they also have fellowships that I would really strongly recommend. I've had the chance to meet some of the fellows. And again, much like some of the other things that I've been talking about, a lot of policy is bringing together different fields of expertise so that the people who are making the policy can learn what they need to and write the policy. And the CUSP is fantastic with those kind of helping to explain how that happens. I have really enjoyed it. I have found it really frustrating in the times when we've had a piece of research or something like that that we have believed should be driving policy, only to discover that it doesn't overlap with whoever is responsible for that area's current needs. Equally, we've had times when, for the various serendipity of funding cycles or end of year or whatever, where we've had policymakers themselves come to us and say, do you have an expert in this particular field? We're looking for X, Y, and Z. And kind of another, I talked a little bit about how part of my job is to know the gossip and to know people across, in my case, the campus and the university. a lot of that, again, is one of the things, at least for me, is a pleasure of my job, is that because I end up knowing a lot of people and how they connect, that has helped my policy, or where I can help interact with policy a lot as well, because a lot of that is then being able to connect and find the right people and join them together at the right time with the right background in, you know, the right settings to be able to make change happen. So a lot of it is accidental, and that's frustrating, but there is things that you can do to make sure that you have all the accidentally right people in the right place at the right time.
That's great. So relationship building is quite an important part of the role.
Exactly, and understanding the landscape.
Okay, and and equally sort of having those networks within the university. Absolutely. It sounds like it's going to be important to sort of repeat that externally as well, especially when it comes to this question, thinking about policymakers and how you access them.
Yeah. And actually, I would say that's true though for media more widely. So a lot of when you get a new paper, for example, one of the first kind of jobs that you do when you read it is you think, to some degree, how big is this story? Is it a BBC News national headline? Is it a ITV Anglia kind of level? Is it a BBC local radio level? Is it a Cambridge Independent level? Is it a departmental newsletter level? And making that assessment is actually often one of the first things that you'll do. But then that also means knowing what types of new, where does this belong and who do I know that I can get that in, that I can pitch it to. And sometimes it's a combination of all those things as well. But really understanding your network is much wider than just, the person next to you. It's really being able to start to get the message out widely. It does require an eventual understanding of all the different places it could go. And that, in terms of, I think earlier we talked about challenges. For me, 5 years in, 6 years in, it's much easier to do that now than it would have been when I first started. And I did find that very frustrating. No, I didn't. Not so much that I found it frustrating, but it's a bit of when you're first starting out, it's the unknown unknowns. So if you can't yet imagine all of the different places and people and organizations and tools and techniques and channels that you have available to you until you start to learn about them, and over time you kind of build up a bit of a mental map. And I don't think there are any shortcuts to that other than talking to people, networking, sticking it out. And when you move, even as you go up through your career and move around to different jobs, unless you really change field, a lot of that kind of comes with you. So I wouldn't lose that if I went to work for another organization in research across the UK, I don't think, because it's all part of that same or similar landscape, I hope.
That's really interesting, and I think really reassuring as well, because if you were interested in science communications, it might not be within all of our sort of realms of possibility to have connections with some of those press offices, for example, and to know how to build those relationships. So it's reassuring to know that those things are grown from the ground up when you start off in these kind of situations. So we're going to draw towards the end of the session, and I've got some more important event information to share with the audience, and some further resources for people to look at. But I guess if I could, Amanda, invite you to just share one final thing with us, if that's possible, in terms of perhaps one thing that you wish you'd known before you got into this area of work, or one final piece of advice that you would give to people looking to get into science communication. What would that be, please?
I suppose this speaks to my identity and how I ended up where I am now, but definitely don't see science communications as a cop-out. Science communications is the end of, or the kind of the final bit of how research should be anyway. It's not an add-on. We absolutely need professionals working in this field, because otherwise all of that research that you've been working on all those years just gets wasted. And I just would really passionately encourage you, if this is something you're interested in, don't feel embarrassed or bad or anything like that. Because we need more people. We need more people to do it well. And I think this comes from how I saw my science career as I was coming along. It took me a long time to understand that. Like, I made the joke at the beginning about how, oh my God, I had to do biology, and then when I went on to do qualitative research, and it is a joke that reflects on myself, I suppose, but I have come to passionately see that it is as important part of the research chain as the people applying for the funding and doing the research and running the clinical trials or whatever, because there is no point doing research at all if the policymakers, members of the public, people, organizations, commercial organizations, etc., don't find out about it. And that's the piece of the puzzle that you can fill in as part of every other, part of the research chain, as it were.
So I'm going to leave it with our final thanks to you, Amanda, so much for everything you've contributed, for giving up your time. It's been really, really helpful. So enormous thanks from all of us.
My absolute pleasure. As I'm sure you can guess, I love to talk about research, so it was just an opportunity and a stage for me to do that.
Thank you. Well, we've benefited from it hugely, so thank you very much, and thank you to my colleague Nick for organising the session, and Lucy as well for supporting and sharing so many things in the chat.